Welcome to the Touching Lives podcast. I'm your host, Kim Kirkman. Today we're being joined by Reverend Barkley Thompson, and he is going to be talking about some of his experiences walking beside people at the end of their life. So first of all, thank you for coming.
It's my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. In our Western culture, death is often treated as something to avoid talking about and not discussing. Why do you think that is, and how do you think it affects the way people experience the end of life?
That's a great question, and it's a question that preoccupies a lot of my time as both a priest and a Christian and a person of goodwill in the community. I read one time that our culture shifted into modernity. Everything shifted towards idolizing life. I think if we're students of Scripture, we know that every failing, every sin, if you want to call it that, is really some form of idolatry or another. And as we moved into a culture that discovered antibiotics, you saw this trend even in architecture when the front parlor of the home, which used to be the place where a person would lie in a wake would be held, somebody would lie in a casket, and friends would come in, sometimes for days. That became the living room. And it was actually an intentional shift away from acknowledging the reality of death, not just as something we each personally go through, but the reality of death as a communal experience that people not only acknowledged, but leaned into. We were able to fend off death with medicine and technology, and we became generally speaking, so materially affluent and comfortable that we were able to convince ourselves, I think, that death, if not that death was an illusion, that death certainly was something we could push into the future. And so we did everything we could to avoid it until today, when even as someone is dying in the hospital room, so often the family will avoid acknowledging what's happening, even to the person who's dying. It's tragic.
So you've mentioned some of the historical reasons why we've gotten here. From a spiritual perspective, what does it mean to prepare ourselves for death if our culture is pushing it off? And how can people begin that preparation long before they're in the hospital room and they're facing terminal illness?
I think so. I'm fond of saying that we die as we live. I had two parishioners at a parish long ago whom I will call Pete and Charlie. And they were both physicians, and they both died well into their 80s. And on paper, their lives had been parallel. They had both been, medical directors of the hospital and so forth. And I attended both of those men at their dying, the lead up to their death and at their deaths. And Charlie died well. He was not afraid. He was laughing and joking the day before he died, and he knew he was dying. Charlie was not someone who would have pretended that he wasn't. Charlie died the way that he lived. I could never get Charlie to talk about himself, even when he was healthy. I knew him to be such an interesting person, and I wanted to know more about his life. He had been a hero in the early 1950s in this town. This was in Roanoke, Virginia. There had been a polio outbreak, and one of the dark secrets of the town that had lived through the institutional memory, the communal memory, was that many of the doctors had fled town with their families during this polio outbreak. Charlie was an orthopedic surgeon. He was not an infectious disease doctor or even a family doctor, but he stayed. He sent his family away, and he stayed to tend to the polio. But I couldn't get him to talk about that. He only wanted to talk about his family or the church, and he died well. Pete, by contrast, died afraid. Pete, every time I went to see him when he was healthy, he wanted to talk to me about his accomplishments, and it was almost as if he was desperate to justify his life. And because he lived in anxiety and desperation and some fear, and in a way that was so sort of self-referential, he died afraid. And so I think we die as we live. So the key to a good death is actually a good life, right? If you start with a terminal diagnosis trying to figure out how to die well. You still can, but it's a much more challenging endeavor than if we have. I think it's easier if you're in a faith tradition. My own is Christian, but there are other faith traditions as well, and I think each of those faith traditions offer us a way of living that is selfless rather than selfish, that is communally oriented rather than ego-centered. And I think when we listen to and live by the virtues of our faith traditions, it actually prepares us. We live well, and so it prepares us to die well. The challenge is we compartmentalize our faith traditions so much now that we don't live into them. We compartmentalize them at best to a couple of Sunday mornings a month, right? Rather than thinking of them as ways of living, as opposed to some sort of duty that we fulfill for a couple hours a week.
So these two men that you just described had similar careers and seemingly lives, but their way that they approached death was so different. So families, and I personally have my mother on hospice, and she's afraid. She doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And how would you give some practical steps to helping families have these conversations so that they can help their loved one navigate this end of life?
I think the first thing that I do when I'm with a terminal parishioner or talking to their families is don't start by addressing death. I mean, so for instance, let's take it to the other end of life. If you're talking to a child who you know is going to have to go get inoculations, you don't start by saying, they're going to give you a shot, but don't worry, it'll only hurt for a minute. You start by talking about, what does the pediatrician's office look like? Who is the pediatrician? The pediatrician is someone who's there to help you when you're sick, to make you feel better. You lead up to the topic at hand, which is you're going to get stuck by a needle. In the same way, I think to begin talking to someone about death, first talk to them. What I encourage families to do is get your loved one to tell stories. Pete always wanted to talk about things he'd accomplished. You know, this wing of the hospital has my name on it. What I would have hoped Pete would have talked about was, what are the things in life that have given you joy? Where have you known love? And I think storytelling is the best way into deeper conversations. Death is as deep a conversation as we're ever going to have. And so first, to get one's loved one to remember, what are the family connections that have been meaningful? What in their lives have given them the greatest sense of accomplishment, not as a name on a building, but in a way that added meaning to their life. I mean, Viktor Frankl taught us 60 years ago that what we're searching for ultimately is meaning, not accomplishment, but meaning. And so to tell stories of family, of faith, of love, can move the person out of a posture of fear of what's happening in the unknown and into a posture of support and love and grace. And once we've sort of reframed where we are, then we can start talking about God and the reality. I believe the reality that. Well, let me pause. I'm what's called an emanationist. Let's get into some sort of deep theology. There are a couple of ways to think about the way that we're created. One is the prevalent one in Christian faith. It's creation ex nihilo, or from nothing. And it's the idea that, you know, there was nothing, and then like God creating a lump of clay and then molding it into the cosmos. That's that image. But there's another image, in Orthodox image, not heretical image, in Christian faith that's called emanationism. And it's the idea that God sort of breathed us into existence, like that image in both Genesis and John's Gospel, where the Spirit of God or the breath of God, the same word in both Hebrew and Greek, is used for spirit and breath. And so God's spirit or breath breathed the cosmos into creation. It's almost as if God overflowed, and the overflow is creation. If we think about us as God's overflow, if we think about us as God's breathed spirit into the world, then we can imagine our death as God taking us back. In fact, the word inspire means to breathe in, inspiratio, which is to breathe in the Spirit. And so God inspires us at our death. And if we can talk about that, the God that breathed you into the world is going to breathe you back into God. The God who, all of those things you've been talking about with your family, the stories of love and meaning and grace and joy, God breathed all those things into existence. And what death is not, it's not an end. It's not a snuffing of the candle wick. It's rather the return of all of those things back to God. But you can't start with that heady theology. You have to start with all of those things that have given that have created the matrix of meaning around a life. So I'm a big fan of encouraging those who are terminal, if they're willing to record their stories. Used to be 23 years ago when I was first ordained, I would say, write your story. Now, anyone with a phone can become a StoryCorps project, right? And so to tell the stories is, I think, the way to get someone into the conversation that can ultimately lead to death as the return to God.
I really like that analogy of returning to God instead of ending or snuffing out. So, hospice is a scary word for a lot of people. I have started using in examples when I'm speaking that hospice is the same root word as hospitality. And we have a wonderful feeling about hospitality.
Yeah.
When someone compliments you, you have wonderful hospitality, or this is, something that you aspire to be. But for some reason, hospice feels like you're giving up. And so how do you help families understand that hospice is not giving up?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that very notion of giving up leans back into what I started off talking about, the idolatry of life. I had a theology professor, pastoral theology professor in seminary, who was fond of saying, death is what happens when the body can no longer sustain life. It's not a failure. Yeah, I'm a cancer survivor, but I'm actually not a fan of people using fight imagery when we talk about cancer and cancer treatment, because ultimately when the fight ends, someone has won and someone has lost. And I don't think death is losing. We are created as fragile, and think about it this way. A diamond is beautiful and a rose is beautiful, but their beauty is exactly opposite to one another. A diamond is beautiful because it is indestructible. It's the hardest thing on earth. A rose is beautiful because it's transient and fragile. These flowers, the beauty is because a flower is here today and gone tomorrow. That's why it's precious. And that's why our lives are precious, because we're not designed like the diamond. We're designed like the rose. So what I would say to people is, well, one, I would say, when I was ordained over 20 years ago, hospice was so new. I have watched, in my ordained life, I have watched the hospice movement grow, and I have never known a family to engage hospice and regret it. Never. I've known plenty of families who realize after the fact, if I'd known about hospice, if I'd paid attention, if I hadn't kicked them out of the room in frustration when the nurse case manager tried to explain it to me, because it seemed like a capitulation of some sort. So I think hospitality is the way to do it. And I've actually used that image so in my grandparents' generation, it was the tail end of that the front parlor as opposed to the living room, right? And when an old person was ready, they would take to bed. We don't use that phrase anymore. But what that meant, that was organic family-based hospice. It didn't mean they were going to die tomorrow. It meant that they were, my grandmother did this. She took to bed in our home. She had lived in McGee. She moved up with us. We set her up in the bedroom in our home. She put heavy quilts on her bed. She played lots of solitaire, and people would come. She would hold court in that bedroom. We would go back and see her and spend time with her. But what it meant was she had lung cancer, and what it meant was she wasn't going to have, she wasn't going to allow anyone to perform heroic measures. She wasn't going to do anything other than maybe an antibiotic for palliative reasons. It was organic in-home hospice before that was a thing. And so I think, again, if we can employ, I love the realization that they come from the same root, hospitality and hospice. But if we can also employ those images that are still floating around in the ether, I have told people the story. I tell people all the time, families who are facing hospice or facing end of life, about my grandmother and about how her death and the last days of her life were not, I think she'd have lived less time had she been in a hospital with tubes hooked up to her. I think she actually lived longer, and I know she lived whole, more centered and more grounded because she was able to, her life ended on terms that she set. And really what hospice does is it allows you to set the terms, right? It's because of our culture, you hear things like death. I thought hospice was death doctors, right? Or things like that. And I think to actually, it's exactly the opposite, right? It is those doctors who recognize and and the doctors here, whom I happen to know at LifeTouch, are certainly this way, who recognize that the family needs agency. The dying person and the loved ones around the dying person need agency. I've been in a hospital as a patient. You lose agency, right? You feel like the guinea pig or the moth on the corkboard who's being stuck. Hospice patients and their families are able to reclaim agency, and I think that's the key to helping people understand that they're getting to set the terms. But there's no way around the fact that they have to recognize that death is real, right? That people only get comfortable with hospice and the notion of hospice when they get comfortable with the notion that we're all dying.
One thing that you said about, and it's the same phrase that I've heard, she's taken to the bed. And it's maybe an old country phrase, but it really is true on how, the natural part of our life, when we want to be at home and we want to be comfortable, and those are all the things that hospice allows. I too have recommended hospice to many people, many friends, and sometimes they say we're not ready for that. What they mean is they personally are not ready for their loved one to be in hospice. And every single time they say back to me, we wish we'd have started earlier.
Yes, for sure.
They're taking the responsibility that they didn't because the death doctor, or, we've even had patients that have come into our service and they ask the nurse, when are you going to give me the shot? Like they think,
it's a physician-assisted suicide.
Yes, that's what I've signed up for. So just the myths that are out there are hard to deal with because we're trying to do something that is a gift to their family for all the reasons. So in your work, you've had the opportunity to walk beside families. How do you think, and you've mentioned your grandmother, how do you think this has changed the way you live, dealing and helping families with the end of life?
I can give you a concrete example. My grandfather, not the grandmother that I mentioned earlier, but my other grandmother's husband, died without knowing he was dying. We knew he was dying, but we did not share that information with him. And I'll carry that regret until my own dying day. So one way that family members will often say to me when someone's in the ICU or in extremis, We don't want her to know that she's dying. And as gently but insistently as I can, I encourage families. I certainly want to know when I'm actively dying. There is this notion that, I want to go like that. People say I want to drop dead on the golf course or whatever. I don't. I want to be able to get my affairs in order. I want to be able to say those things to the people that I love that need to be said. I want to be able to mend those tensions wherever that can happen. I want to be able to pray. I don't want to drop dead. I want to at least for a little while know what's coming, and when we withhold that information from our loved one, I'll speak in I language. When I participated in withholding from my grandfather that he was dying, I now recognize that in a way we robbed him of being able to navigate intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, the fact of his own dying. So that's one major way that I hospice. It's very difficult in an emergency room to have that conversation. If someone is dying very quickly, has had a stroke or a heart attack, there's so much ambient fear and anxiety in the room, whether it's the person in the hospital bed or the people around. So it's not always possible to navigate those situations well. But when someone's dying is over an extended enough period of time that hospice can be brought in, then you're given the gift of being able to have those conversations. If in no other way, you're given the gift of being able to blunt, if not remove, physical pain. It's not always possible to completely remove physical pain, but in hospice, you're certainly able to navigate pain in ways that so very often give the person in the hospital, the person in the bed, and family members the space to shift out of that sort of panic and have those real conversations. I guess I would say, to me, that's the biggest change is realizing that hospice provides the space to be able to have the conversations that you can't have in a panic.
Well, one of the services or parts of the services that we have with a social worker, with a chaplain, and a bereavement specialist, where you are anticipating grief, that gives the patient and the family opportunities to talk with things that they may not be trained or have planned to talk about. And I think that opens up some conversations as well, to be able to, and so many times when you're in the hospital, you might have a caseworker, but you don't have all that depth of services with the chaplain and with the social worker and bereavement specialist to be able to have conversations.
Let me add one thing to that, because I know that Dr. Bell and Dr. Wyatt here at Life Touch are friends and acquaintances with Dr. Christopher Kerr.
Yes. I
am too. And Dr. Kerr's hospice in Buffalo has done a lot of work and continues to do a lot of work with waking dreams and visions that those who are in hospice have of their loved ones. I'm not entirely sure how I would explain those experiences, but I believe that they are true and real. I have been with people who have had those experiences, both in my own family and as a priest. Those kinds of experiences can be so cathartic. They're so common. One of the things that Dr. Kerr's work has pointed out is how very common those experiences are. But when one is in a hospital, an ICU bed in the hospital, no time or space or empathy, there's not room, temporally or physically, for those working in an ICU setting in a hospital to give credence or space for those kinds of experiences. And those experiences are meaningful and important. And so another gift that hospice gives is the space, the room, and the empathy to give credence. You talked about bereavement specialists, chaplains, and medical providers in hospice are increasingly aware not to debunk or think of as hospital hallucinations, which is a term in the hospital, those sorts of experiences, but to let those experiences be what they are, not try to explain them or explain them away, but to give space for them. Because as a person whose realm is the spiritual, professionally and vocationally, I think that's so important to people in hospice.
Well, I read, Dr. Kerr visited Life Touch Health in the winter, and I read his book before he came, and I'm experiencing with my mother some of those things that probably would have frightened me or wanted me to think that it was a hallucination of some kind. But I feel really calm and want and encourage her to talk with me about them, because I have the opportunity to know, I'm not an expert, but I have a knowledge about that they're common, and that people are, she's enjoying memories from her grandmother that I never heard before now. So it's a gift to me to get to hear those. My last question was, do you have anything to say that I didn't ask you, but you got to share that? Do you have anything else that you'd like to share that we might not have touched on?
I hope that if there are other ordained clergy, I'm very fortunate that I'm a priest in the Episcopal Church, and our denomination has leaned into hospice and palliative care, and that's made it easy for me, because there have been encouragements all along the way from my clergy colleagues, from my bishops, and my hope would be that for ordained clergy of other traditions that for whom hospice may not be quite so prevalent, that hearing a pastor, hearing an ordained person talk about it would open minds and perhaps opportunities, and that would be my hope. I think that I'm just a believer in hospice, and I hope that others can become that too.
Well, I appreciate your time today and your depth of expertise. That has been really beneficial for me, but also for our viewers in the future. So I appreciate that. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Barkley Thompson is a board member for Life Touch Health Foundation. We're very grateful for his service and for the time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
For more information about Life Touch Health, visit lifetouchhealth.org. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, and share it with someone who may benefit from today's conversation.